Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today, both in person but also virtually here. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this highly anticipated panel discussions on Putin's playbook in the Middle East and the implication for the EU. Over the past decade, Russia's presence in the Middle East and Africa has grown significantly, drawing international attention and concern. Despite the ongoing conflicts in Ukraine and increasing isolation from the West, Russia continues to pursue an active foreign policy aimed at reviving its status as a global power. These developments pose numerous challenges for the European Union, particularly in terms of policy effectiveness and strategic influence. Today, we'll explore key questions such as the EU response to Russia actions, its support from Middle Eastern and African nations, and the broader implication for EU-Russia relations. To guide us through these topics, we are honored to have a distinguished panel of experts. I would like to first invite Mrs. Anna Borshevskaya. Mrs. Borshevskaya is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute, focusing on Russia policy towards the Middle East. She is widely published and the author of Putin's War in Syria. Please join me in welcoming Mrs. Anna Borshevskaya.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I prepared a few brief remarks simply to start us off to have a conversation, but I would really look forward to engaging with you afterwards, specifically when it comes to your direct questions that have to do with this issue, because there's so many directions in which we can have this conversation. So I'd like to set the stage to have with a few broad remarks as a foundation for this discussion. And I'm going to focus my remarks on three main points. First, I'll start with Putin's global aims and then zero in how those fit in the Middle East and implications for the West at large. First and foremost, what Russia is trying to do, what Russia has been trying to do for quite some time, is to remake the world. Russia wants to see a different world order. And this search for this goal of a different world order has been most visible in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but you can certainly trace it in Russia's approach to the Middle East. And that really segues into my second point, is that specifically the Middle East has been an arena of great power competition between Russia and the West. Furthermore, there are connections between the Ukraine theater and the Middle East theater. Lastly, my last point will be about Ukraine and how it connects to the Middle East and to Europe. And that point is simply that there's more continuity than disconnect between European and Middle East theaters. Therefore, what happens in Ukraine doesn't stay in Ukraine. What happens in the Middle East does not stay in the Middle East. It's more important than ever than to ensure to help Ukraine win, but because it's going to help us in both of these arenas. So with that, let me go into a little bit more detail about each of these points. Again, I'm not going to belabor too much. This is simply to have set the stage for the discussion. But my first point about Russia's interest in remaking a global order. The Russian government has resented the fact that Russia lost the Cold War. And really, that should be the starting point for having this conversation. The Kremlin in the intelligence circle that came into power with the rise of Vladimir Putin, they resented the fact that the Cold War, that their country lost what was the greatest geopolitical struggle of the century. And they were looking for another opportunity to play in this contest with an alternate ending. And when you think about Russia's activities, be they, again, in the post-Soviet space, in Europe, in the Middle East, elsewhere, that really is the broad framework in terms of what the Kremlin wants to achieve. And to that end, when you hear Russian officials talk about a multipolar world, what's behind that idea is, again, resentment of a US-led liberal post-World War II order, post-Cold War order. What Russia has been looking for is a renegotiation of that order overall globally, and specifically a renegotiation of the European security architecture. And on that second point, again, is what we're seeing playing out in Ukraine. The Middle East, for its part, has been historically an arena of great power competition for several centuries. And it pitted the West against Russia in all of its iterations. It began with Imperial Russia and Great Britain, and then continued into the Cold War between the United States and USSR. And with a brief break in the 1990s, we saw it unfold with the rise of Vladimir Putin. Um, the difference is that Vladimir Putin had pursued an approach different from the Soviet Union. In other words, the Soviet Union had a rigid ideological approach. Putin's Russia was far more flexible in terms of how it approached this region. And that certainly reflected in the types of relationships that Russia built in the Middle East. But ultimately, the goal again was zero sum, and that was for Russia to win. The United States and the West at large had to lose. Um, if if it was too strong a message prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine that Russia was fighting a war with the West. It may not have been a conventional war, but it was a war of sorts. Certainly, the invasion of Ukraine leaves no doubt that this is what Russia is trying to do. And Putin has at this point been pretty direct when he talks about the war in Ukraine and how he perceives it. And he perceives it as an existential battle. That is how he casts this war, as an existential battle between the West and Russia, where supposedly the West has attacked Russia using Ukraine. The Middle East was an important arena where, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russia has been able to garner additional support, additional resources in its effort to to avoid isolation from sanctions. And this segues into, again, more into my second point about how the Middle East matters. We talk a lot about Russia being as the most sanctioned country in the world post invasion of Ukraine. Um, we look at Russia's massive losses in Ukraine, but the fact of the matter is, outside the liberal free world, Russia simply has not been isolated, and if anything, Russia has been able to gain more ground, which has in turn enabled Russia to gather more resources to continue to fight the war and avoid isolation. And it is visible both in the narrative realm and in the practical resource realm. For one thing, Russian narratives resonate in this region, broadly speaking. And again, I'm making a very broad blanket statement. And second, what comes out of that perception of buying into the Russian narrative is that the Middle East in particular simply has been continued to be able to be willing to do business with Russia. If anything, Russia's trade with a number of Middle East countries has grown since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And there are many other avenues in which Russia uses this region to foster growing chaos, distraction from the war in Ukraine. In other words, Russia is not simply a bystander and capitalizing on existing chaos, it's actually making it worse, diverting Western attention from Ukraine, and finding alternative resources to continue to fund its war. And let me with that point in mind, let me turn to my last point, and that is because of this global connection and this regional connection between the European and Middle East theaters, when we think about how to achieve a victory in Ukraine, how to achieve our strategic aims, looking at this broader global picture, it is especially imperative to ensure Ukrainian victory because until Russia's alternative vision of a global order is discredited, um, countries outside the liberal free world will continue to see Russia as crucial to world affairs, and one way or the other are going to continue hedging their bets. A Ukrainian loss in the war is going to embolden our adversaries worldwide, and by the same token, a Ukrainian victory is going to do the opposite. It's going to be the best deterrent to our adversaries. So it is especially imperative now more than ever to ensure a Ukrainian victory because it matters not only in Europe. but worldwide, as both our adversaries and friends are watching. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Anna Borshevskaya. It's now time to introduce our second speaker, Mr. Kurt Deboeuf. Mr. Deboeuf is a political analyst and author with a focus on Middle Eastern politics and European foreign policy. His extensive field experience provides a deep understanding on the geopolitical shifts affecting the EU. Mr. Deboeuf, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will not focus on Ukraine because I think that has been sufficiently done by Anna. But what I agree, and I would like to add on the strategy of Russia, is what Russia wants is a new world order in which they are no longer dependent and inferior power-wise to the West, mainly the United States, of course, but on the same level. So that's what they have been trying to do since quite a long time, and in several ways. So the first thing they have tried is actually put themselves back on the negotiation table through the Middle East. How did they do that? First by helping Assad in Syria, and then trying to organize peace conferences, which was called the Astana process, in which they could again be in the lead of well, be important enough to lead negotiations. I saw this in Rome, actually, when there was the Rome Met conferences where I saw Lavrov on the podium, and also Zarif. And when this Astana process was going on, they felt extremely happy. Usually they were a bit like angry on Europe, but they felt like, you know, we have done something without you, because the EU and US were not invited into the process. So that's one thing, let's say, that they have been trying to do, but which also failed. So the second way of doing, let's say this is the constructive way of trying to have a seat again on the table, on the small table. The second way they have been trying to do is a bit less positive. It's namely to undermine the EU and the US. In the US, of course, by interfering in the elections. In the EU, in several ways. One of these ways was clearly through the Middle East. So in 2014 and 15, when, of course, ISIS started to be there, when the destruction in Syria became higher and higher, and we had the refugees, at least 1 million crossing the street, some people said, also mainly in Central Europe, I thought that Russia actually helped pushing refugees and migrants through to Europe. They have done this with little numbers, I would say, through Belarus to annoy actually the Baltics and Poland and so forth. But at large, what they did do is actually use this crisis to undermine the public opinion of the EU by messaging, by spreading false news. And the panic in Europe was enormous. And people started to panic, like, oh my God, who is coming? Secondly, these refugees, are they nice people or are they wrong people? So, and one story that is, I think, very symbolic for what Russia has been doing was, at a certain point, there was a story in Germany that a girl had been kidnapped by 3 Syrian refugees, being raped, and after 3 days sent back home. The story was false, but it was immediately spread by RT in Germany. It became the front page news of every single newspaper in Germany. Politicians started to react, and in the end, it was fake news. It never happened. So, but by doing this cycle, and it's just one example, because of many examples, we actually don't know how these trolls are trying to undermine, with refugees from the Middle East, European public, and asking, and also destabilizing our society. How, to what extent that will have succeeded, I think we will see on the 9th of June during the European elections, where everybody suspects indeed that the extreme right is going to win. One of the big players in making this happen was Russia. So this is the second element. The third element, the third way in which Russia is trying to destabilize Europe, is actually helping military coups to create chaos in countries that are connected, let's say, with Europe. That was very clear, I mean, in the Sahel up to now. So where we have seen military coups in Mali and Burkina Faso and Niger that have all been extremely anti-European, mostly anti-French. So we've seen this in the Central African Republic. We don't know yet what's happening in Congo. Actually, it's not very clear. But what is clear, I mean, in Sudan, is where they're trying to have a port, supporting the Janjaweed, I mean, creating chaos. And of course, chaos in all those countries push again the migration to the north, which is again what is the goal of the Russian policy there. And there are two countries that I mean, Libya is also still in chaos, and I can't blame Russia for that. I mean, many countries are to be blamed for that, Europeans included, mostly Russia and Italy. But it is very clear right now that the next, let's say, victims of Russia are going to be Tunisia and Chad, where an ambassador is doing great work, where Kais Saied, the new president, I would even dare to say half crazy president, and with a lot of dictatorial intentions, is being supported by Russia. We know that Chad is chaos, and they might take over again by some sort of military coup. So you see that the partners that were of France mostly, but not just of France, actually collapsed and became allies of Russia. Actually, why is that important, this strategy? I think this has two meanings. First of all, I mean, they annoy, of course, the Europeans by doing this. They're cutting off partnerships that were there before, not always good partnerships, but okay. Secondly, I mean, trying to push in some moment what Europe fears most is migration. So, and we might see at some point again migration from that part of the continent going through Tunisia or to Libya or to Egypt, maybe not. But secondly, and my last point is what Russia is doing in the Middle East, but not just in the Middle East, is just making sure that the general support for the West is decreasing. We have seen this for the first time on the 7th of April 2021, the vote, after the invasion of 22, sorry, the vote in the General Assembly of the United Nations, where actually kind of easy question, is it okay to suspend Russia's membership from the Human Rights Council of the United Nations? Would say, yeah, well, that's the least thing we can do. Well, there was no majority for it. I mean, in the end, there was a majority because 20 countries have walked out diplomatically and went to the bathroom. So, but there was no majority, and there was no majority for sanctions. There was no. So the majority that has always been there to support the West against, for example, Russia or against China, is actually disappearing. And in the end, the Middle East plays a crucial role in this international geopolitical game, and it's actually a role that the West is losing. And the worst thing is that we are actually only half aware of what is happening, and that is causing me a lot of, well, not distrust, but a lot of a kind of disappointment in some institutions around here, but also worries in what the next Commission will try to do about it, because the way they have been trying to do it now is clearly not working.
Thank you, Mr. Dabaf. Just coming back to what you say, what do you think would be the best way for the new Commission, the new elected Commission to do to, you know, strive against what you just mentioned?
I think there are two things. First of all, it's changing the way you talk to countries outside the EU. I mean, the European arrogance, I mean, Europeans do not understand, do not know how arrogant they are. I mean, I remember I was with a French colleague in Lebanon, and he was trying to explain Islam to my Muslim friend. I was like, I don't think that's a good idea. And secondly, he was talking about his European values, and I told him, like, okay, but what does my Lebanese friend believe in? Lebanese values, or what is this? I mean, so it's a kind of way of thinking, I think, that needs to change and needs to rethink our own, well, being in the world. But secondly, I mean, we think that, European institutions see themselves as the good guys, the ones who are having good intentions with the world and so forth, and actually are taking good decisions. But when we see, I mean, for example, what happened with Palestine and Israel, and where the EU was always pleading worldwide as the beacon of human rights, and then suddenly it is not following that course anymore. What happens in Gaza makes the EU massively incredible in the entire world, but mostly in the Middle East. So the loss of credibility on that point is massive.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Dabev. Maybe we could open just for a few moments some questions to Mrs. Anna Borshevskaya or Mr. Kurt Deboeuf. All right. So we have received some questions online. The first one, if that's the case, if Russia frustration with the Cold War is the source of Russia disruptive actions now, what can we realistically expect to be a deterrent in the future? Maybe Mrs. Anna or Mr. Kurt?
Well, I can start. So the question is, what can we realistically expect to be a good deterrent in the future?
Indeed.
If I heard that correctly?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think if I want to go back to my original point, this is precisely the issue that we're struggling with. We see that Russia remains a security threat, a security challenge, a persistent security challenge for Europe and for the West at large. So precisely how to deter Russia, there's no one simple one-word answer. I think a victory in Ukraine would is certainly really the center of this discussion, precisely because Russia started a war, the largest war on European soil since the end of World War II. And in terms of how we achieve that, and also if we look at where else we can deter Russia, and here we're talking about the Middle East, I'd like to underscore the point that was just made that the West is losing, and I apologize, I hope I heard it correctly. What I heard is that when it comes to narratives, when it comes to our perception, the perception of the West in the Middle East, we tend to be on the losing side. So correct me if I misunderstood that point, but that is what I heard. And here, what I would say in terms of deterrence, there are multiple tactics and strategies that we need to be deploying. One of them has to do with the battle of narratives in the Middle East between Russia and the West. And to go back to my original remarks, the region at large tends to buy into the Russian narrative, to many points on the Russian narrative, and conversely tends to view the West often as hypocritical, as not tending to their partner's needs, as preaching liberal norms and values, but then not following through. And here, I just want to underscore again that perception often matters more than reality in politics. And here, this is a matter of perception, at least in part. So when it comes to the reason why narratives are so important is because historically, when it came to warfare throughout human history, the stories that we told ourselves about who we are, they had to do with morale. They had to do with ability to garner the fight, to garner willpower. It's a psychological aspect of any kind of conflict, any kind of contest, really, whether it's direct or indirect. And in the Middle East in particular, we are losing a war of narratives. And it is because we're losing the war in narratives that the Russian version of events tends to resonate more. And to go back to my earlier point, Russia has been capitalizing on that by continuing to do more business with this region, finding resources. One other thing we could do is we could simply more effectively help Ukrainians project their narratives into the region, because the Middle East simply does not hear the Ukrainian narrative.
Thank you. And then a second question came up, which is because of the Western sanctions, Russia needs to sell oil to the East, China, India. But because of the situation in Gaza, the Houthis are effectively blocking vessels, including Russian vessels, from transiting through the Red Sea. Isn't it Russia's interest to resolve the situation in Gaza?
It might be in the interest of Russia in general, but I mean, the longer this is going on, I mean, indeed, the less attention and efforts that are going to Ukraine. I mean, the United States is very much absorbed with what's going on in Gaza, and the United States State Department is large enough to deal with both. But I mean, politically, right now, has become a danger even for the re-election of the president. So it is a very important point. The protests that are going on in the U.S. on the campuses are not about Ukraine; they're about Gaza. So I don't think this has been pushed, maybe in some narratives on social media by Russia, but it's for them it's nice that it's going on like this. So, and the Houthis. Most of I mean, Russia has a lot less trade going on through the Red Sea than, for example, Europe and the United States. So I think it hurts more the West than it hurts Russia. So for them, I mean, whatever is going on there, I mean, is not bad. I mean, I do not see any disadvantage for them. Having said that, I also think that Russia don't really have leverage on Israel-Palestine. They have a historical connection to the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, but that is slightly still there. But I don't think they have any leverage over the Palestinian, and certainly no leverage over Hamas.
Thank you, Mr. Debev. So finally, I would like to give the floor to, yes, sir?
Thank you very much. I do agree with you about double standards on the Gaza issue. So that there is frustration in the world about position of the West on this issue. Even more frustration is about approach to the International Criminal Court warrant. We see from one side we all applaud International Criminal Court warrant against Putin. It created lots of popularity of International Criminal Court. But now when International Criminal Court takes decision on Hamas and also on Prime Minister Netanyahu and on Goltz, Defense Minister, there are threats to impose sanctions on the judges of the court. Of course, where is correct line? Also, I believe that the West doesn't understand that the world has changed dramatically, so that it's not only Russia, but there are the club of dictatorships which are cooperating very closely and are very effective. Who could have imagined that, like 10 years ago, that small countries ally of Russia, like Azerbaijan, would create headache for France in Caledonia, in New Caledonia, riots, and French Interior Ministry accused Azerbaijan of inflaming riots in New Caledonia. Nobody could have imagined that a country of former Soviet Republic could create headache for leading EU country, France. So that there should be understanding that the world has changed and new, different approaches are needed. More understanding of the regions needed. Russia, with its proxies, like Aliyev, Lukashenko, and others, they work hard.
Yeah.
They invest on media, they invest on TikTok. TikTok became platform of these dictators, and fake news are spread by
Thank
through
you.
TikTok widely. And what the West does in counterbalance this.
Thank you for your point. Finally, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Richard Czarnecki, who is for his valuable insight as well. Mr. Czarnecki has an extensive experience in European politics and has been a vocal advocate for a stronger EU response to external threats. His insights into the political dynamics of the EU and its foreign policy are valuable for our discussion today. Please join me in welcoming.
Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Sorry, I'm not present personally in Brussels, but you know, and I hope you understand me, I have campaigned to the European Parliament election to June to European Parliament. But thank you for joining us today for this critical discussion on Putin's playbook in the Middle East and implication for our European Union. Understanding the strategic moves of global powers, the Russia and their impacts on our geopolitical landscape is vital for the European Union future. Over the past decade, Russia's presence in the Middle East and Africa, especially, has grown. Really, President Putin aims to reassert Russia as a global power through military also economic partnerships in Syria. Moscow's military support has assured a key ally
Unfortunately, your connection is
similarly,
breaking.
Russia involvement in Africa through military and economic means strengthens its influence, challenging Western dominance. A few words about the implication for the European Union. The implication for our EU structure are really significant. Russia's action present imitates security risks with their military presence near Europe, posing potential threats. Politically and obviously economically, Russia's alliance in these regions undermine European Union efforts to promote stability and democratic values. These developments complicate our efforts to maintain influence and foster cooperation in the Middle East and Africa. And finally, few words about our European response. To counter these challenges, the European Union must adopt a multifaceted strategy. Firstly, strengthening alliance. The European Union needs to reinforce NATO presence and enhance cooperation with global partners. Strong alliance will deter Russian aggressions and reassure our partners of the EU's commitment. As well, a few words about economic and diplomatic engagement. Intensifying economic and diplomatic engagement with Middle East and African countries is essential. Offering alternatives to Russian partnerships can help these nations achieve stability and reduce their relations on Russia. It's our plan. Investing in strategic communication to counter Russian propaganda is crucial. Promoting the European values and policies effectively will combat misinformation and highlight the benefits of aligning with the EU. Finally, a few words about defense and security, because I spent more than 4 years in the Senate Security and Defense subcommittee in the European Parliament. Bolstering our defense and security capabilities is necessary to later threats. Investing in advanced military technologies and enhancing rapid response mechanisms will ensure our readiness. And final conclusion. The European Union faces a complex challenge with Russia's growing influence in the Middle East and Africa. By the way, I hope that everyone read the last article in Le Monde about the huge transfer of Russian weapons from Syria to Libya. It's a very interesting information, especially in French newspapers, French media. By adopting a comprehensive strategy, we can safeguard our interests and contribute to global stability. I look forward to today's discussion and the insights from our esteemed panelists. Thanks a lot. Together, we can develop the strategies needed to navigate this intricate geopolitical landscape. Thank you very much for your attention and participation. Good luck.
Thank you, Mr. Czarneski, for taking the time today. So before going on with some questions, I would like to briefly summarize our discussion today. We have explored the multiple challenges posed by Russia's growing influence in the Middle East and Africa, and the strategic responses required from the EU. Now we have received some questions online that I would like to share with our speakers, and then we can, of course, take more questions from the rest of the audience. First one that came is, how can the EU protect itself from Russia's election interference? Any thought on that?
There are a few ways. I mean, the problem is that it's mostly on social media, and actually Russia is already for since many years trying to divide our society, polarize our society on every single issue. So the polarization is for them the most important thing. Will they rig our elections? I don't think so. but they have made the society so polarized, or they helped to do so, at least, that I think in the results of the elections that we have seen so far in Europe, I mean, have been polarizing elections. So, and that's the biggest problem. To me, the problem is not if Europe goes to the left or Europe goes to the right. I mean, the problem is that it is becoming less, there is less and less center. So it becomes more difficult to make coalitions, to take decisions, to indeed, so it makes Europe weaker, being polarized. And I think in order to do something about that, a grand strategy is necessary. And unfortunately, I mean, which is being discussed also in the EAS about, because foreign intervention, misinformation, sort of FIMI, but it is very small. So, and there's more analysis than there is action, even though I think they know what to do. It's almost nothing. So, I mean, to me, I mean, much more important than buying weapons and so forth. And I mean, although that's a point that many are making, is making sure that our society remains healthy in itself. I mean, having psychological resistance against this kind of stuff is much more important, I think, than bullets and arms.
Thank you. Coming to the next questions is what are or should be the incentives for Middle Eastern countries to side with the West against Russia? Any?
I can take this question, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So I think that first, let me start by saying there's no easy answer to this question, because I've been following Middle East reactions to the war in Ukraine since the beginning of Russia's invasion, and I've participated in a number of private conversations with officials from the region, and the fact of the matter is, it's been a far greater challenge than maybe we've acknowledged. By and large, again, the region responded at best with ambivalence to the war, a kind of also either fear or simply lack of desire to antagonize Russia. And I think when it comes to how to counter these issues, I think there are a couple of, there are a few possible steps. But first, we don't have a strategy on how to do this. I think to some extent, the West was caught fairly by surprise by these reactions. They should not have come as a surprise, but the West was surprised. And I think the earlier point that our panelists made about arrogance that comes through sometimes when we speak to our partners in the region is one issue. There's also, and more broader, it speaks to the fact that we often we don't engage into in the issues that matters to our region. We also need to think of how practically, again, from a purely practical, purely economic, non-values-based perspective, the war is perceived in the region. So, for example, when you think about the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia, the Biden administration was surprised when Saudi Arabia didn't change oil output. One would think that lower oil prices was a common goal that would help, that we shared, and certainly lower oil prices would help reduce Russia's resources and therefore its ability to wage war. But for a whole host of complicated reasons, the Saudi Arabian leadership simply didn't see things the same way. You can start by doing things like, again, what I mentioned earlier, by helping Ukrainians simply project their narrative into the region. By and large, the Middle East simply does not hear the Ukrainian side of the story. And therefore, they simply do not buy into our version of these events. When it comes to also, when we think about individual countries, I think we need to think of creative ways to tend to our partners' needs better. Certainly, we need to think of better ways to deter Iran, because when it comes to perceptions of the West as being hypocritical in the region, one of the things that has come out persistently is that we rushed to help Ukraine, but we didn't do as much to help our own partners in the Middle East when their own security faced challenges. And so again, I want to stress it's an issue of perception. So when it comes to deterring our adversaries in the Middle East, and in this case, we're seeing Iran and Iranian proxies in the Assad regime. And this, by the way, this anti-Sunni group, if you will, is where Russia's relationships are strongest. Putin, by and large, has cultivated an image of somewhat of a peacemaker, somebody who can talk to all sides in the Middle East. But the fact of the matter is, he always tilted closer to anti-American forces, anti-Western forces, and that is Iran, Iranian proxies, and the Assad regime. So we need to think creatively about how to engage in this region, how to address our partners' needs, and how to ensure that this region remains our priority, ensure our partners also that we're not leaving the region. And again, that's only part of this very complicated question.
Thank you for your explanation. The last question we've received.
Can I add something?
Of course.
To this? I just would like to come back. I mean, I agree with what you have said. I just want to come back to what the gentleman here said about the ICJ and the ICC. I mean, to me, I mean, that I'm not shocked by it. I'm angry by this. I mean, you know, they say in Africa, if the Chinese come, we get a hospital. If the Europeans come, we get a lecture. No? I mean, we have been lecturing around the world about democracy and human rights. And if you do not this, then we'll drag you to our courts and so forth, and you will see. And al-Bashir and so forth, and have been getting arrest warrants by the ICC. And we're all applauding this, but then suddenly it's someone we like more. It's coming closer to the West, although it's in the Middle East. It's Israel. Then suddenly, I mean, senators from the United States are threatening the judges. I mean, this is really, to me, this is not just crazy for me. I mean, if you are, and as the entire Middle East is sympathetical to the Palestinians, not necessarily to Hamas, and you see this happening, and then suddenly the international order is not important anymore, and the rules-based and blah, 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 and it's just all into the garbage bin. I mean, and then you suspect that we can convince with some rhetorics the people of the Middle East to be sympathetic to us if we come again with our conditions, because all the packages of the EU, I mean, what our concern with financing, funding and so forth, it all goes with human rights and democracy conditions, all of it. It's not always applied, but it's always there. I mean, it's always part of discussion. So we have to think about which kind of discourse do we want to have? I mean, are we going to say, you know, these human rights conditions, we don't care anymore because indeed we have showed we don't care about it? Or are we and we don't know how to approach it, and that's the biggest problem. So Russia does it very cynical, and as does China. China, no principles. Here is the money, build something, and just, if I ask you something, just give it to me. But that may be in 10 years. No worries about it. And that's the reality. While Europe is trying to be the good guys, and it's a nightmare. I mean, we are in a nightmare position worldwide, and I'm shocked that people are not seeing this.
Thank you, Mr. Deboeuf. And the last question from online would be, how can Europe invest in military technology and defense without causing a new arm race? Mr. Deboeuf or Mrs.?
Not. It's impossible. I mean, if we are we gonna buy a lot of arms? I mean, then you know, at some point we want to use them. So some war is again coming, some bigger war than already is happening today. So, you know, if you count the European armies and all the arms they have, I think just European, not even NATO, just Europe, I think is 3 times bigger than Russia. So if we would just pull them a bit better together, we would already be a big force. Now, and it's not against Washington I'm saying this, but it was Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary General, who said that from the EU countries, they have now placed for the next 2 years orders for arms for 200 billion in the United States. So actually what we are doing right now, we are sponsoring the economy of the United States. I mean, while I think there are some other things to invest in Europe right now. So I'm just wondering if all this discourse that we are hearing, if this is the right strategy that we are taking. And I'm not a friend of Putin, on the very contrary, and it's with horror I see what is happening everywhere, and certainly in the Middle East and Africa, but of course also Ukraine and so forth, and the threat that is going towards countries like, for example, even Kazakhstan or maybe Azerbaijan. So they feel the constant threat, so this must stop. But how? And with this how, we're just using the old rhetorics, okay, let's buy arms and that will solve everything. And I'm not convinced of that.
Thank you for answering. I don't know if Mrs. Anna, would you like to add something, or should we?
Yeah, sure. Very briefly, in maybe 10 seconds, if we're concluding it. I just want to add also that I would look at this question in a different way. The question is, the question was, how do we do this without starting an arm race? I would encourage us to reframe our thinking, really shift our thinking. Because whether we like it or not, war is upon us. Russia has started a war. Russia has not paid a price for prior to invading Ukraine. Russia has not paid a price for invading Georgia in 2008, then annexing Crimea in 2014, and then going militarily into Syria in 2015. So Russia did not pay a price for all three of these interventions. It emboldened Russia to perceive the West as weak, as not, and contributed to Putin's belief that if he was to invade Ukraine on the scale that he did, there would be no resistance. My earlier point was that Russia has been at war with the West for quite some time. Again, not a conventional war, but a war nonetheless. And the issue is, we may pretend that it's not happening, but Russia certainly is not pretending it's not happening. So because Russia is perceiving itself as fighting an existential battle with us, the right question for us is not about starting and not starting an arms race. It's about how do we best deter Russia together with other adversaries such as Iran and China.
Thank you for complimenting. Maybe if anybody here would like to add something or add and ask any question to the audience, please feel free. Well, I'll take that as a no. So thank you all for coming. Thank you all for your time and discussing all these topics. And I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Thank you.